What's up, gamers? This video is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan, and I know what you're wondering. Who's that guy on the raft over there? That's a good question. It's a great question, in fact, but I'm sorry to say it's a long answer. You may think us both being stranded in the middle of the ocean means our stories are connected, but no. His story is an epic one, a story of shame, greed, and madness at the edge of the world. And as for me, well, I was on a Carnival cruise ship, and thought I saw a penny in the water. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Some of you may recognize that poor dumb fucker on the raft as a minor player in my 3-hour manifesto, The Fall of the Aztec. But for those of you who did not watch my Fall of the Aztec series because you were busy kicking puppies and chugging cock that weekend, in the year of our Lord 1519, Hernan Cortez set out on an expedition from Cuba with the blessing and, more importantly, the funding of the Cuban governor, Diego Velázquez. But at the last minute, Velázquez tried to stop Cortez, as he'd lost trust in the man, once he remembered that Cortez once tried to betray him. Then, shockingly, Cortez betrayed him and left anyway. You see, the reason Velázquez sent Cortez and didn't just go himself is because Velázquez was waiting for an adelantado, which was a license from the Spanish crown to colonize new territory. Velázquez wanted that adelantado as bad as your mom wants me to call back, as the cities the Spanish had encountered on the previous 2 expeditions there were, well, cities. They had governments and resources and shit, as opposed to the stinky island people that the Spanish had thus far dealt with, who were just awful. Because they barely had anything worth stealing. Won't someone think of the investors and their subpar profits? The Cortez expedition was intended to just gather intelligence on the area and investigate rumors of a rich kingdom further inland. Velázquez wanted to conquer and colonize the actual place himself, but Cortez, through some shady legal fuckery and lies, would move to take this rich kingdom, which we now call the Aztec Empire, for himself. This was the beginning of a protracted political battle between the two men, as Velázquez argued Cortez had committed treason, and Cortez argued that Velázquez was a fat loser. Velázquez would finally receive that adelantado while Cortez was in Mesoamerica, doing Cortez shit. And so Velázquez sent his man, Panfilo de Narvaez, with a force thrice the size of Cortez's to drag his ass back to Cuba in chains. But Narvaez would lose his eye and his men to Cortez and his many Tlaxcalteca allies. In my Aztec series, this was my last mention of Panfilo de Narvaez. He was a footnote. Whatever became of Narvaez? This story starts in a dungeon and ends in a desert, as Spanish slavers look in shock upon the 4 sunburned survivors of the Lost Expedition of Narvaez. Yeah, I'm a gamer. I game. I compete. You may call me a loser, but what do I do while you sit there, scrolling on your phone while Netflix plays in the background? I win. And if there's one place to win, it's War Thunder. Take charge of one of over 2,000 military vehicles which have been lovingly recreated down to the component level. My favorite part is that every time I die, I've deprived the Germans of ammunition. Also, I don't need to buy a flight stick or whatever. I can just play with a mouse or keyboard or even a controller. Furthermore, the vehicle selection spans over 100 years of actual military technological development. You can play free on Xbox, PlayStation, or a computer. Also, Linux, you can play on Linux, for all 2 of you on Linux. You can play low-skill arcade baby matches like me, or tell every woman you've ever met that they should look elsewhere as you dive into realistic, simulation-level fights. Play War Thunder for free, now do it! And use my code to get a free bonus pack, which will get you started. This is a limited time offer, so hurry while it's available. Game! Hey buddy, how's the eye? Oh, the silent treatment. Yeah, that's how you get back at me for destroying your career, taking your eye, and imprisoning you for years. Wow, this really hurts. We're even now. What do you want? Oh, well, I wanted to give you the good news in person. Velasquez is dead. You killed him! No, he was fat and old, so he died. You can rest assured knowing he's still a pain in my ass, though. Did you know he had the gall to leave my money for his heirs? Like, his estate's been harassing me. What a dick. That money is theirs. Oh no, I stole it first fair and square, but that doesn't matter. I'm here to give you some more good news. I'm letting you go. Well then no, I'll return. I'm not done with you, Cortez. Well, I'm done with you. We can only imagine how Narvaez felt upon getting released from his years of imprisonment under Cortez. His years of service to Crown and Conquest had lost him his eye, his pride, and now, 50 years old, no small amount of his life. Driven by these thoughts, Narvaez would return to Spain, begging for an adelantado of his own. And my God, did he receive it. Narvaez was seeking an adelantado right around the same time that the Spanish crown was beginning to get antsy about this Cortez guy doing shady shit on the other side of the world. So, granting land to the immediate north of Cortez to his old enemy must have seemed a safe way to cap his rising influence. In fact, some of the territory that Narvaez received was territory discovered by a Cortezian expedition. From the Pacific to the east coast of Florida, the territory granted to Narvaez was vast, to say the least. Narvaez planned to start his colony at the mouth of the Rio de las Palmas. This colony location would have the benefit of number one, being very near other Spanish settlements, and being a great staging ground for northern expeditions. And so, Narvaez set out from Seville, Spain, with 5 ships and 600 men in the year 1527. Also, I just think this is neat, one of the men on the expedition was a nobleman from Texcoco named Don Pedro. I don't know what his name was before he converted to Christianity, but I can only assume it has too many syllables. Regardless, when this expedition stopped at Hispaniola for supplies, 140 men deserted, so not a great start. Narvaez would catch a break, though, when his expedition later stopped in Cuba, as a man who I just keep stumbling into in my research, Vasco Porcalo, promised some additional supplies to Narvaez. Vasco Porcalo was actually the guy Velasquez was going to replace Cortez with once he realized he probably shouldn't trust the guy that once tried to betray him. So while we can only speculate on Vasco Porcalo's motivations, it figures that he was just generally in favor of a big middle finger of a colony being established directly north of Cortez. There was a catch, though. The supplies needed to be retrieved from the town of Trinidad, so Narvaez decided to kick back and relax on the beach while he sent the expedition's royal treasurer, Cabeza de Vaca, with 2 ships to retrieve the supplies from Trinidad. Narvaez had put his phone on airplane mode when the expedition began, so his weather app didn't warn him about an incoming hurricane. Thankfully for Cabeza, he was on shore overseeing the transfer of supplies when Poseidon came in with a steel chair. But even for the men on land, it was a terrifying experience. The houses and churches of the town buckled and broke beneath the torrential rain and fierce winds, as the men, devoid of shelter, walked arm in arm so as to avoid losing one another. Cabeza does not note if they skipped as they held each other arm in arm, but we can only assume they did. This went on for 2 days before the storm cleared, and the men on shore returned to harbor to see the ships had been totally destroyed by the maelstrom. 60 men and 20 horses died in the storm. So that means, between the hurricane and desertions, the expedition had lost 2 ships and 1/3 of their men, and they had yet to leave Spanish territory. The town was so thoroughly destroyed, the men had no choice but to wait for rescue as they searched for salvageable supplies along the shore. They found nothing, save for 2 dead sailors hanging from the trees around 30 miles from the harbor.
We remained in this state for several days, in considerable need and hardship, since the food and supplies at the village had also been destroyed, as well as some cattle. The country was pitiful to see. Trees had fallen and the woods were blighted with neither leaves nor grass. The situation continued until the 5th day of the month of November, when the governor Narvaez arrived with his 4 ships.
In case you were wondering, Narvaez purchased another ship, so that's why we're back up to 4 ships after losing 2 in the hurricane. You see, while Cabeza and his men were trying to survive the hurricane, Narvaez was actually doing more than just sipping Mai Tais on the beach. I need a pilot. A man familiar with the northern Gulf Coast, for I am Panfio de Narvaez, appointed by Crown and Christ to conquer and subdue that most wild and dangerous frontier. So who here can guide me and my men safely to the riches and glory which we have been promised? I know the northern Gulf Coast. Ah, God smiles upon me once again. What's your name, sailor? Mirwello. So, how well does this job pay? Handsomely, my man. It pays handsomely indeed. So, what trials and tribulations await us on those seas? Well, the northern Gulf Coast is northern. Is that right? I think so. Well, that's good enough for me. As you could imagine, experienced navigators were in high demand in the Spanish Caribbean, and Mirwello might have been one. We don't know, but he will, as our story continues, fuck up a lot. For example, once Narvaez began sailing for the Rio de las Palmas, Mirwello was continually guiding the ships to shallow waters where they'd scrape the seafloor, like right off the coast of fucking Cuba. The man was not only unfamiliar with the little-known northern Gulf Coast, he was unfamiliar with the coast of the fucking island upon which he lived. But still, the expedition would make landfall safe and sound, despite numerous terrible storms and Mirwello's crippling crayon addiction. But they were blown off course a bit, so there was no Rio de las Palmas in sight. Believing themselves to be south of their intended destination, they began following the coast north, until they spotted a bay with some villages. One of the men did some trading at an island village in the bay, before a larger force of men set out for the island later, so as to make friends, I'm sure. But they found that the village was now totally empty. Well, this is ominous, but it doesn't matter. I, Panfio de Narvaez, claim this land in the name of Charles V. In his name, I bring our Lord God to these untamed and wild lands, filled with smelly dirt people. Hey! Oh, hi. We were gone for like half an hour. Well, you're mine now. Please point me to the nearest river so I can make you pan for gold in it until you die. Get the fuck out of here! The Spanish then left the island, finding it to be stinky and dirty and full of nerds. Exploring further inland, the expedition found 4 natives who they showed some corn to, and asked if they had more. At this point, I should be clear. The story of the fall of the Aztec was defined by its translators. While countless misunderstandings occurred between the natives of Mesoamerica and the Spanish, La Malinche and Geronimo de Aguilar would serve as a vital bridge between the Old World and the New. Cortez was, in this regard and approximately 1 million others, unfathomably lucky. And you may be beginning to notice that Narvaez was as lucky as a black cat born under a ladder in the Gaza Strip. All of the communications, from the village and onwards, were done via pointing and gesturing and shit. The 4 natives took the expedition to their village and showed them their corn, which wasn't much, but it was honest work. This was the lifestyle of most of the natives the Narvaez expedition would find here. Small villages with limited subsistence agriculture, usually just growing corn. Yup, this here's our crops. And what's that over there? Why, those are our Spanish shipping crates which we recovered from some unknown shipwreck and stuffed with dead bodies wrapped in painted deerskins. I do reckon that any city slicker YouTubers with an anthropological bent and several upcoming Hague trials would be quite interested in what the significance them there crates have to us, and indeed how we stumbled across such an oddity here, I do declare. Okay, you sound like Foghorn Leghorn, please dial it back. I say, wouldn't you like to see the treasures of our people? Thanks, but I've seen deerskins and loincloths before. Aztec Empire, this is not. Fucking Cortez. Oh, now, you look more sour than an opossum in a place that opossums do not like to be. We may be a humble village, but we got a nice golden bauble right here. Oh. Oh my. You know what? You people might be worth killing after all. Where'd you get that? Why, a Palachi, of course. The Spanish burned the crates full of dead fuckers and deerskins, like assholes. Anyway, the scantest hint of gold did to the conquistadors what it has done to every investor since the dawn of time. It made them abandon any and all common sense and charge headlong down a path which would destroy themselves and everyone unfortunate enough to cross paths with them. Narvaez decided that the ship should continue north in search of the Rio de las Palmas, while the men would scout around on land for a palachi and meet the ships later once they'd collected sufficient provisions of cash and sex slaves. Cabeza de Vaca advocated against this, saying they should remain with the ships because they still didn't really know where they were, and despite the minuscule amounts of gold,
yikes.
The country we had seen was the poorest and most desolate ever found in those parts.
It should be noted that Cabeza de Vaca is our only real source on this whole thing, so whenever he comes across as smarter than the rest of the men, you should take that with a grain of salt. Regardless, the ships continued north with the sailors and wives which some of the men had brought from Spain, while the men set off in search of a palachi. This was a risky move, sure, but they're not exactly searching for the Northwest Passage. They were just beyond the edge of Spanish-controlled territory in Panuco, and...
Oh, please. You've strung them along for long enough, don't you think? Your more astute viewers are probably already beginning to suspect that these people thus far described do not belong to the highly urban and complex societies of Mesoamerica.
Oh, you're no fun. All right, computer. Tell them what's happening.
The hurricane encountered by the contingent of the expedition in Trinidad was not the only natural phenomenon which would doom this expedition to a long, languishing death. The Gulf Stream is an ocean current that enters the Gulf Coast from the south, exits between Cuba and Florida, and continues on to Western Europe. The means of navigation used by the Spanish at this time, known as dead reckoning, was ill-suited to accounting for this current, which was already not understood by the Spanish. The powerful current with the stormy weather they had seen at sea had pushed the ships east. The men were not near the Rio de las Palmas. They were not in modern-day Mexico. They were not in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, nor even Alabama. The bay the men made anchor at was modern-day Tampa Bay, a region that had no Spanish settlement to speak of. To put it simply, the men and their ships had parted ways and planned to rejoin at a river they believed to be 10 or 15 miles away, but was in fact over 900 miles away. The men, in their delirious gold lust, had stranded themselves.
The ships moved north in search of the mouth of the Rio de las Palmas as the men disappeared into the Florida wilderness. Once it had sunk in that the river was nowhere to be found, and in fact they had no idea where they were, the crew began searching for the men in earnest. But despite searching for nearly a year, they would see no sign of the men again. That was, until they spotted a letter stuck to a cane in Tampa Bay, at which point, things got real weird. Real fast. Hey guys, can you bring us that letter? We think it was left behind by our friends who went missing around here. Why don't you come get it? Oh, it seems to me this is very much your problem, and something you should solve on your own. So, what does the note say? Well, it's not good news. In the ensuing struggle, one of the men who went for the letter died, and the other, named Juan Ortiz, was captured. Supposedly, when Narvaez had been in the area previously, he cut off the nose of a Native American chief, and the natives, having procured some paper and a cane from the men, set about making a trap so they could get revenge. Juan Ortiz would spend 11 years captured by this tribe until being rescued by the De Soto expedition. Besides this encounter, the year spent in search of the Narvaez expedition found nothing, and they returned to Cuba, believing the men to have died. But Narvaez's wife, Maria de Valenzuela, moved to Santo Domingo, which was the beating heart of the Spanish Caribbean at the time, to oversee her own self-funded search party. She hired 2 ships and a man named Ceballos to lead it, and Ceballos gave it a solid 2 months before saying, I could continue this search for 400 corpses, or I could convert this widow's sadness into hookers and blow. So he sailed to New Spain, sold the ships, and pocketed the cash. Ceballo then began living the high life until the widow Narvaez showed up with La Chancla, dragged his ass through court, and got him thrown in prison. But badass widows and funny letter fuckery aside, no one would find a single piece of evidence of what happened to the men. The Florida wilderness had swallowed them whole. The The expedition was running short on supplies the second the ships left, with each man having a ration of less than a pound of pork and a pound of hardtack each. As such, they had to depend on stealing corn from the small native villages they came across, which resulted in some rough encounters, but after much hardship, the men would find Apalache. And it was like 40 huts in the woods, a settlement barely larger than those the Spanish had already been coming across. Believing the place to have gold hidden somewhere, the Spanish attacked while the men were out hunting, taking the women and children hostage. When the men did show up, they attacked a bit before asking, if the Spanish could just give them their women and children back. The Spanish agreed, provided they were given the native chief in exchange. Okay, so as I've said previously, controlling Native Americans by taking custody of their leader was the normal Spanish MO. This tactic, of course, has its roots in The Art of War by Sun Tzu. If one wishes to control a hostile population, you must first ask to speak to their manager. A month would be spent in Apalache, and it would not be spent well. They would spend the time getting attacked, sending expeditions to the coast in search of the Rio de las Palmas, and questioning the chief and some other prisoners that they got.
Our prisoners told us, each one by himself, that the largest village of that entire land was Apalache, and that ahead there were fewer people, who were much poorer, and that the land was poorly populated and its inhabitants widely dispersed, and that going forward there were great lagoons and dense woods and great empty and unpopulated areas.
Okay. Computer, explain what happened.
Apalache was not a village, it was a people. To quote from A Land So Strange by Andres Reséndez, Apalache was only one among dozens of chiefdoms that flourished between AD 1000 and AD 1600 along the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. They practiced intensive agriculture, became organized as highly ranked societies, and took part in long-distance trading networks. They were the most powerful chiefdoms north of Mexico. Present-day scholars call them Mississippian societies. Their temples, houses, and square-based pyramids proclaimed their might, end quote. To put it simply, the Narvaez expedition had found a small village at the edges of a highly developed urban population, and had the chief they had taken hostage answered these crude invaders' questions honestly, the men would most certainly have penetrated deeper into this territory and found the sort of riches which they had been looking for. To quote once more from A Land So Strange, by casting Apalache as a small and impoverished chiefdom, the village chief cleverly discouraged the Europeans from traveling further into their territory. He was just as clever in advising the strangers on the best route to the coast. For after enduring weeks of constant guerrilla incursions and despondent about the seeming poverty of Apalache, Narvaez's men had ceased to fantasize about gold and were now thinking only about saving themselves.
Defeated, broken, and helpless, the Narvaez expedition made their way to the shore, taking casualties the whole way, at one point having to walk through chest-deep swamps, as natives on the shore shot arrows with impunity from the surrounding woods. Now I understand some of my audience are not epic gamers like me, but for those of you that are, imagine in Orlando. Now imagine it's also a poisoned swamp. God himself had delivered a hell onto the Spanish beyond even the wettest dreams of Miyazaki. After 9 days of this absolute hell, the Spanish reached the coastal village the chief had told them was well stocked in supplies, named Aute, and it had been burned to the ground. By this point, the men knew they weren't anywhere near the Rio de las Palmas, but believed if they constructed rafts, they could float down the coast to Panuco, a Spanish territory controlled by Nuño de Guzman, who we will discuss later. The construction of these rafts was their mission from here on, but it was a difficult one, butchering and eating their remaining horses for sustenance. The men began melting down whatever metal they could scavenge into saws and axes, so as to begin the laborious task of chopping enough trees to carry the remaining 250 men. We see here the absolute desperation the Spanish were in, as they quite literally cast their only remaining advantages against the natives into the fire: iron and horseflesh. These sacrifices would help them construct 5 rafts, which floated a mere 6 inches above the water when fully loaded with men. But with nothing but rafts, wits, some jars they'd taken from natives, and bags for water fashioned out of horse skin, The men took to the open ocean, hugging the coast the entire way. The bags, made of horse skin, it shortly turned out, weren't cured properly, so they rotted, which compelled many of the men to drink seawater in a bout of thirst-induced madness, which would kill 5 of them. They managed to find a native tribe, which was friendly until they weren't, and also they took all their fucking jars, and they even stopped on an island in search of water, only to find absolutely nothing. The time spent on rafts was time spent in search of water, as much as it was spent in search of Spanish civilization, and they would find neither, as they followed the northern Gulf Coast, growing weaker by the day. Until, blessedly, they would spot a massive source of fresh water. But this was no ordinary water. These men were the first Europeans to record eyewitness accounts of the Mississippi River. The relief the men must have felt was short-lived, however. As they approached it, eager to drown their thirst, the overwhelming force of the river pushed the rafts 1.5 miles from land and separated them from each other. The men, sick, wounded, and dying of thirst, spent all night fighting the current. And in the morning, Cabeza awoke to see only 2 rafts within eyesight. Leading his raft to the nearest one, Cabeza saw it was none other than Narvaez's raft, and the men aboard were much stronger and able to row better than Cabeza's men. "Narvaez! Who are you again?" "I'm your royal treasurer. Have you lost your mind?" "I've lost just about everything else by this point." "Just throw us a line. Help tow us to shore. My men, we're too weak to row much further." "What do you think's going on here?" "What are you talking about? Just throw us a line. You can't abandon us out here." "The expedition is over, Cabeza. Don't you see that? We don't even know where we are. Every native we come across attacks us. We can't even make bags without them rotting in our hands. Get yourself to shore. It's every man for himself, and God against all." In spite of this disaster, the rafts would manage to all make landfall, but they were scattered like jackstones across the Texas coast. The raft, which drifted farthest south, landed near modern-day Corpus Christi, and according to de Vaca's account, was already completely out of food by the time they reached the Mississippi. The raft's crew, much weaker than the others, would be discovered by the Camones tribe, who killed the men with 0 resistance. The raft, led by Narvaez, would manage to make contact with another raft crew on the shore, and once they were all together, Narvaez quickly tried to reassert control over the situation. "Well, men, God has tested us, but we have all passed. I'm sure you're all proud of yourselves, and of course, thankful to me, for my wise leadership." "Yeah, so you abandoned your leadership position when it was convenient for you? Oh, I see. You're upset, and I respect your feelings." "No, you're not listening. Your feelings are valid. You are valid. That being said, I'm gonna sleep on the raft with the other captains at night while y'all sleep out on the sand like, gross dirt people. That way, if we get attacked, you will have a chance to die for me as I escape. Does that sound good to everyone else?" That night, Narvaez and the other captains would sleep on the raft. But of course, the tide rises. The men would awake to find the leaders of the expedition and the raft gone, and Panfilo de Narvaez was never seen again. We can only assume Narvaez awoke to see the land which he had been promised slip away over the horizon, as he spent the final few hours, or perhaps even days of his life, floating in the open ocean. Narvaez, believe it or not, was lucky. The men that he'd been with would end up resorting to cannibalism as the winter set in, and a native would later stumble upon the sole survivor of these 2 rafts, feasting upon his comrade. The expedition of Narvaez was lost. It was lost to the swamp, lost to the sea, lost to the land and the people which called it home. But what is one day lost will one day be found, and the story is no longer about those that were lost, but now is about those that found them. You see, historians have a great many arguments, some great, some small, and the amateur historian will often find themselves stumbling into these arguments. And an argument has been had over the centuries. That argument being whether or not the natives of the Texas coast were cannibals. Once again, this video is sponsored by War Thunder. I've actually played the game and I enjoy it quite a bit. At the end of the day, it's just fun shooting people in really detailed military equipment. And if you're gonna check it out, please use my code. Remember that doing so will get you all these bonuses here. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it as always. Part 2 is coming soon. There's a weird break in the narrative. Thanks for your support.